We're over 1,000 varieties in Digitalis alone now, and we have loads of different Sisyrinchiums and daylilies and all sorts of other stuff growing in the beds. Like the Phlomis collection is now making its way, pushing irises out the way in the shady stock. This is called Shadow of the Almighty, and it was a chance seedling. It's got the old-fashioned sort of almost rounded, tailored form to it, but it's just very, very, very dark. I always think they're a bit like myself, really. They're quiet most of the time, but when they start talking, you can't shut them up. You know, they're just out there. You know, look at me, very, very showy. Even the smallest of ones are eye-catching. I think that makes them really quite unique for certainly this climate. You know, early season.
Hello and welcome to episode 87 of Talking Dirty. Over at East Ruston Old Vicarage, looking extremely preppy today, we have Alan Edward Herbert Gray, our happy and very handsome horticulturalist.
Well, thank you for that wonderful, rousing introduction. Now I hear that you've got sunshine or part sunshine. We have grey skies today, and we've just had, in the last couple of days, nearly an inch of rain. So for that, I am thankful. But please stop now, because I need to get out after this podcast. Over in Cambridgeshire, we have Thordis Maria Sophia Fredrickson. Oh, isn't she just delicious? You look like a pink meringue this morning.
You can't tell, but half of the shirt is pink pinstripe and half of it is peachy orange pinstripe.
Wow.
Well, very meringue.
Yeah, I wore this especially for Alan Gray. Joining us this week, we are very excited to welcome Matt Collins to the podcast, of course, famous for writing in pretty much every publication you can lay your hand on, also head gardener at the Garden Museum in London. But before we get into all of that, do you have any middle names, Matt?
Oh, goodness. Wow, what a question. I do. I have a Welsh middle name. I used to hate it as a child, and I've sort of grown over time to like it, but it's Hywel with an Hywel, which is about as Welsh as it comes. It was my grandfather's middle name as well. But yeah, Hywel. Wow, what a question.
Both my middle names came from grandfathers.
There you go. That's
Edward and Herbert.
Lovely. Yeah, I mean, that's what grandfathers are for, really, bestowing names.
Yeah.
Sadly, I have no grandfather names in mine. But Hal, did you get teased at all? When kids at school?
Relentlessly. You're joking. Howell, because no one could say it or spell it. So it was a daily chore to have to go through, really. Howell, yeah. I tried to formally change it to Hugh for some reason. when I was like 10 or something, I demanded my parents change it to Hugh, but thankfully they didn't go through with it. And I'm in older age, I appreciate the more kind of
I think that's what happens, actually, because you have your parents for giving you the names you've got.
Yes.
For a certain period of your life, and then you actually grow into them, as it were.
Yeah, you do. Yeah.
I don't know. I think a dear friend of ours who appears on this podcast regularly, Ian Roof, likes to call himself on social media Ian Scott Roof, because it reminds him of the likes of Graham Stewart Thomas, etc. Maybe you just need to embrace it entirely, like Matt Howell Collins.
Hugh Howell, yeah.
Yeah, that's really quite good. Just change the whole thing.
Just change the whole thing.
You know, Graham Stewart Thomas only called himself, that was his middle name. His name was Graham Stewart Thomas. He called himself Graham Stewart Thomas because he thought it sounded posh.
I did.
He was a horrific old snob.
Yeah, well, you've got to be a few roses, haven't you?
So I don't even know where to start with talking about you, Matt. There's so much to cover. I suppose we should start with the Garden Museum, just I suppose in case people don't know what it is. So
yeah. Well, it's funny. Lots of people don't really, but it's definitely a place that's getting a bigger and bigger name for itself, which is really exciting. I think we sort of claim the title that we're one of the very few museums that actually actively expanded our staff and our reach during the pandemic, which is bizarre. But I think really fortunately, probably down to the fact that so many people started gardening when they weren't gardening before, which was good for us. So yeah, the Garden Museum is in central London. It's opposite Westminster. It's got this amazing view. It's the part of the South Bank that people sort of forget. So it's the bit that it's right next to Lambeth Palace. It's a former church building, St Mary's Church, that was sort of deconsecrated and left abandoned in the 70s. And a lovely lady called Rosemary Nicholson found it on account of some of the very sort of esteemed people buried within the churchyard. A gardener herself, she found that the Tredescants were buried in the garden, and they were sort of Britain's earliest garden celebrities, and decided to sort of gradually revive the space and make it, sort of preserve the tomb for a start, preserve the heritage of the Tredescants, and make it a garden museum. So we really began in the 70s, and it sort of morphed and changed and went through a big redevelopment in about 5 years ago, with a whole new sort of structure added to it. And now it exists as a sort of contemporary museum dedicated to the culture and history and interest, particularly the British interest in horticulture.
And when did you enter into the garden museum's life?
I came as a trainee actually about 12 years ago, which is shocking. I've been there a really long time, but I really ought to do something else with my time at some point. But I love it. Everyone loves there. Everyone loves working there. It's a wonderful space. So I came as a garden trainee. They run a traineeship program, which I now run, which we take on one horticultural trainee a year, and we sort of introduce them to get a chance to run the gardens, but they also get to go off and do lots of wonderful things and placements and spend time with gardeners and gardens. But yeah, I came as a trainee, went off to go and look after various other gardens, big private garden in Richmond for a while, and sort of meandered my way back to the museum as a part-time sort of head gardener, effectively.
And people who know your writing will know that it's obviously a horticultural, but there's a lot of travel writing in there. So is travel something that you've always done?
Yeah, it is actually. Yeah, in short. Yeah, my father was he's a vicar, but he was a vicar, but he used to travel around a lot, and he used to go, when I was a child, I used to travel an enormous amount with him, and got to see lots of interesting parts of the world. But yeah, it's always something that's fascinated me. And then as I got into horticulture, it just sort of, the two worked really, really well. You know, seeing plants in their native environments became a real distraction for me. And so that's kind of effectively, that's the niche. It's barely a niche because that's the basis of all horticulture, really, is where do plants come from. But that's kind of where my writing has ended up, is relating native environments to how we garden with plants in the UK.
Yeah, and it's so exciting. You posted something the other day, which was an article you'd written for Toast, I think.
Oh, right.
and the image of the bluebells, you have to just, I think, briefly tell us a bit about that trip.
Oh my goodness, yeah, that's that's just Skoma Island off Pembrokeshire, which is like, I mean, there are a few islands there, but that Skoma is quite special, and it's a real bird island. It's full of crazy birds, and it's protected as a wildlife space. But what's astonishing is it used to be part of the mainland. It used to be wooded. It used to have ancient woodland there, and it was all cleared for agriculture. As it became an island, you know, once it was an island, it was then cleared, and it had the symbiotic relationship like old bluebell woods do between bluebells and trees. And then when the trees disappeared, the bluebells continued, and they sort of developed a new relationship with the bracken that took over. So for a very brief period in spring, you get this unbelievable sight where the whole island effectively turns blue-purple, but without the tree cover that you're used to associating with bluebells. So it's just this like wonderland of sea of blue, which is my obsession. It's like my favorite thing in the world, you know, like acres and acres of just flowers and nothing else. It's amazing. Should go. Everyone should go. Maytime, the best.
You're in the right place, I think, if your obsession is acres and acres of non-stop flowers. This is
and weird bird sounds in the background. Yes. Yeah.
It's funny, actually, because we wanted to get you on the podcast, but the thing that reminded me too was the article you wrote in Hortus about, or articles you wrote about your time at Benton End,
right.
Which it captures all the magic of the travel writing, but obviously by staying in one place that isn't far away at all. It must have been quite the experience to spend some time there, and also what a challenge to deal with that garden.
Yeah, it was cool. It was really, we felt so lucky. Well, it came out of a lack of travel. Yeah, thanks for it. It's lovely hearing people read Hortus, because it's a journal that's very sort of dear to my heart. But we were meant to go traveling for 3 months. We just had a baby. The plan, we'd long had this plan that we were going to go away and take time off work, and obviously with the pandemic that all fell through. So no longer Italy and lovely Adriatic. It was just Suffolk instead, but that was just the most amazing thing ever. So it just coincided with the museum acquiring this very beautiful garden. Well, what was a very beautiful garden, Benton End, the former sort of home and residence of Cedric Morris, who was a very famous iris breeder, an artist, and so the museum needed someone to kind of look after the space. So yeah, it was just like one of those amazing life things where the timing sort of fitted perfectly. They needed someone to look after it and live on site. We sort of moved to this little cottage and on the main site of the garden, and just started sort of picking our way through it and seeing what still remained, which was cool.
What a voyage of discovery.
Yeah.
I mean, Alan, can you imagine just like rocking up, leaving London and rocking up to an amazing historic spot in Suffolk, and with that garden, with that history?
I can indeed. I was just talking to somebody the other day, and I said, that if you can associate the plants with Cedric Morris, it immediately achieves almost cult status. It's a bit like the old roses and the Benton irises, Benton irises.
Yeah.
They've all achieved this kind of cult status. When you actually go back, I think it's quite fascinating. If you go back to the early writings of Mrs. Beth Chatto, you will find that she was influenced greatly by Cedric, because he grew plants that nobody else grew. I mean, he grew alliums, and she was doing flower arranging at the time, and he gave her bulbs of alliums. Nobody grew alliums. They were wild things on the continent and things,
Yeah.
But it is fascinating when you sit, you can appreciate how important it is that people like Cedric lived and gardened the way he did. And that wonderful little daffodil that's named after him, the little Narcissus that blooms terribly, terribly early.
Yes.
It came from the Pyrenees, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. It was found. Yeah, well, it sort of came to him by a dubious story, but yeah, Pyrenean Narcissus minor. Yeah.
No, they've never been able to find it again.
Yeah, it's gone. But it was it's true, and it's amazing, the legacy, and it's getting more and more, his name is once again coming back, and it was
that is a great word, the legacy. You're absolutely right, it is the legacy.
Yeah. And he was, I hadn't realized, the more we sort of delved into it, he died in 82, I think, or 84, 82, and seemingly his name was sort of overtaken by so many other gardeners at the time, and I think his legacy is astonishing, but lots of people credit him really with the birth of kind of naturalistic gardening. Beth Chatto, as you say, was so influenced by the garden, and this idea of, because he wasn't really a garden designer. His garden was never this kind of incredibly well thought out, layered, beautiful garden. It was plants, and associated plants and weird combinations and things very much made.
It was a combination. His life, wasn't it, a combination between gardening and art?
Yeah.
He painted these wonderful paintings of iris and roses and goodness knows what. Wonderful, fantastic still lifes, not that well painted. And to be quite honest, they were all a bit of a joke. People sort of secretly laugh at these paintings. They don't laugh today because they're worth thousands and thousands of pounds. And suddenly they take off. And if you go to Cedric Morris hanging on your wall, don't even bother to ask, because I haven't.
We're finding them.
They would be worth a lot of money. I did go to an antique sale once at Sheringham Hall in Norfolk when they were selling the contents of that house, and there was a fire screen, a little fold-up fire screen painted by Cedric.
Oh, wow.
And a friend of mine was going to buy it, and it made the huge sum then of £6,000, and he didn't. I bet he's kicking himself today.
Yeah, they were. Yeah, it's just amazing, the kind of the recent resurgence, the sort of replay, and it really was kicked off in lots of ways. Obviously, with Philip Mould finding lots of the paintings and sort of looking into that, but with Sarah Cook, the head gardener at Sisyrinchium, and sort of rejuvenating the iris collection and bring them back into popular cultivation.
Yeah. So, what was it like delving into that garden, and what state was it in when you started work on it?
Well, like you said, it had this element of exploring a wild country, really, a wild landscape, because what survived. So he was quite rare, Cedric Morris, in the fact that he appointed a gardener's executor when he died to sort of give away all of his plants. So all the perennials, pretty much all of the perennials, lots of the shrubs, lots of things were given away. So what remained were species bulbs, which he was really into, that were able to self-seed, and how hard it is to eradicate any kind of bulb really from a garden completely. And so really what I was finding was mostly throughout spring, and so it was this wonderful journey of I suppose, a walk, like you said, a walk through Europe, really, like finding these plants as they started to arrive, which would just sort of link to various travels that he went on. He's back, and he was very much in that era where you could squirrel things into suitcases, probably not even hide what you were pillaging from these sort of rare environments, and so he brought back so many of these plants himself. Obviously he was given them as well, and he sort of acquired quite a collection. But so what survived really were the formal sort of arrangement of the garden, which for a time was these kind of island beds, and there's a sort of theory that he might have been one of the early precursors of that, those, the sort of Richard Bloom Alan Bloom island bed situation. But it was originally that, and that kind of morphed slowly over time as you got older, and weeds crept into these, effectively to meadows. So grass had all crept in, and within these meadows is sort of 4-block meadows in the old walled garden. That's where I would find, in really random places, these kind of sparks of colour. And it was so exciting because every morning I would go out, with my tea or whatever, and walk sort of barefoot through the garden and slowly find, oh wow, there's an ornithogallum there, or there's an amazing muscari there, or so it really was bulbs mostly, with a few old shrubs that still remain.
That is so exciting.
Yeah, it was cool. It's a real geeky pursuit, but I loved it. It's hard to explain to my friends back in London who weren't of the gardening sort, but it was just everything I wanted to do. And we had our new, we had a sort of 1-year-old at the time, and so it was just a really amazing, while everything was locked down as well. I mean, that's what made the magic, was the idea that we kind of had to be on our own in this space. Like, it was all kind of on lockdown, really. So it was a good excuse to disappear into a garden like that.
Has it influenced what you've done since, in terms of gardening and plant choices and design or anything?
Yeah, completely. Yeah, I used to grow all sorts of silly, blousy cultivars in pots and things like that, and especially, which is great. But in the garden museum, I think it was a nice link with the museum, because it really sort of tuned my eye. I mean, Cedric had this amazing eye for the very subtle details of bulbs. That's what he loved. He was obsessed with dark fritillaries, these fritillaries that you have to get right up close to kind of appreciate the subtleties of the various chestnuts and oaks, and colorations of browns. And that really tuned my eye, I think. It made me think, well, why not? The museum is small, we have a beautiful courtyard, it's a place to try interesting species plants in pots that people don't necessarily recognize or know. So it really sent me on a journey of how to do more interesting species pots and things like that.
Have any of those made it into show and tell today? Any of your interesting...
Ooh. No, I did almost pick an ornithogallum and something else, but no, I've done my show and tell we'll come on to it, but no, none of those have made it in, unfortunately.
And you've just moved into a new house.
Yes.
What kind of garden does your new house have?
It's small. I'm looking at the entirety of it right now. It's small, but believe it or not, it's my first ever garden of my own. So it's a classic rectangle in a sort of a terrace street. In a tiny village in Hampshire, and it's chalk, which is totally new for me. I've never gardened on chalk before, and it's very exciting. So it's currently, I don't know, I don't want to be, it's hard not to be rude about the things you inherit, isn't it? There's some shockers out there, but they've had a go. They've had a bloody good go.
I don't think you need to worry about being rude about it, because I'm doing the same thing in my garden the whole time. And that is these what some people might call basic ordinary plants that you plant because they're probably good doers, if you like.
Yeah.
When you get to a stage in your life where you think, well, you really are so common, I ought to get rid of you.
Well, isn't there that mantra, does it bring me joy? There's all that. I've tried to apply that to the garden recently. Who was it that wrote the whole book about that? Does it bring me joy? So I'm looking through these plants currently of what previously has been planted in this tiny little garden, and trying to base it on whether it's well suited. Lots of geraniums and things, I suppose. And there are a few roses that need to go.
The thing is, what brings you joy does change, because this is my first garden of my own.
Oh, cool.
And I really wanted, of all the things, I really wanted a flowering currant. And so I got one, and now I'm not sure it does bring me as much joy in a small garden as I wanted it to. So I'm really torn, because it's a lovely mature thing and it is glorious in the spring, but I'm not sure it does bring me as much joy as I wanted, as it did when I first put it in. So I suppose what brings us joy...
No, that's typical. That is typical, because we've all done that, I think, when we start with something. I mean, I remember my first Deutzia that I bought, spring flowering Deutzia, and I thought it was the most wonderful thing since sliced bread, but I soon grew out of it. I
have a small garden. You have a small garden, Matt, but Alan, you haven't always had 32 acres.
No. I mean, I gardened wherever I gardened first of all at both grandparents' houses. I had my own little garden, and I could do what I liked with it. And I used to get castigated. But I made a parterre out of Lonicera nitida. And I used to clip it with Granny's sewing scissors, and I got castigated for that because I blunted her scissors. And then when I moved to London, I had a garden on a roof, which was notoriously hot and dry, and dried out all the containers on the roof dried out terribly. There weren't automatic watering systems in those days. So you had to lug cans around, which was a bit tragic. Then I had a garden in what was a light well, really, which is like a roofless cellar almost. But I grew hostas and ferns and mossy things and, things that like dripping conditions. So I adapted. So, yeah. And then we came to live here. I do know next year in 2023, it is 50 years since we bought this house.
Oh, wow.
You two whippersnappers, well, you just can't comprehend that. It is amazing. Where has the time gone?
Was that 50 years of garden as well, or did you leave it for a little while, or did you jump straight?
No, we bought it and we came up every weekend, Matt, for the first 13, 14 years, I suppose.
Right.
We had our holidays here as well. And I think it was the advent of modern telecommunications that allowed us to come and live here permanently. Then we bought a little bit of extra land. So we started with 2.5 acres. We then went up to 20 acres, and then we went up to 32 acres. But it's not all, there's not 32 acres of formal gardens here.
Nearly.
No, there's woodland, and there's areas where we've planted collections of trees and orchards and all that kind of thing as well. So it's not all. Hello, I'm being interrupted by my dog.
And actually, as well, it divides up into, I suppose, smaller spaces and smaller gardens. None of them quite as small as, as we worked out with Ian Roof, your drawing room is the size of Ian Roof's garden. So that's where we're at. Our garden is the size of the rooms in Alan's house. So
okay, cool. I'm intrigued to know what my garden would match up to. Probably
which room?
Mission pantry, I suppose. Yeah.
So I suppose after that wonderful foray into your gardening exploits, Matt, we should look at some of the plants you have picked from the Garden Museum. I'm a bit disappointed you didn't do show and tell from this garden you've just bought.
Can I just ask about some of the plantings at the Garden Museum? Because I think, if I remember correctly, you've got some interesting plants like schlepperas and things growing in the garden there. Am I correct?
That's right. Yeah. So in the more recent, 5-year-old garden, which was redesigned by Dan Pearson. We used to have a sort of an old parterre garden, and that very much reflected the sort of Tredescant history in the garden. But when we sort of had to change the garden when we renovated, it was quite a sort of unfortunate, difficult decision, because it meant sort of reconfiguring the whole thing. And we tried all sorts of different configurations of buildings, but anyway, what happened is we ended up with a brand new space, and so it felt right. It was encased in glass, so it felt right to design something more contemporary and modern. So yeah, there are lots of interesting plants. Dan Pearson has sort of conceived it as effectively a giant Wardian case, like a big glass box that within it houses, so it ties into that history of plant collecting, but it sort of houses within it what were probably at the time, this is 5 years on, what we hoped would be slightly interesting, slightly disorientating planting. So planting that gardeners, would come in and not necessarily recognize all of the plants. And that was the idea. And things move so fast in horticulture that, most of these plants are now sort of traffic island, bog standard, plants that everyone's growing, really. We get the occasional people coming in, but yeah, it's interesting planting, and it's exciting. And so it's things, there's sort of interesting ginger lilies and like Wood's ginger lily, the yellow one. And I'm trying to think, and we got a very sort of rare, massive dahlia in the middle, tampaulipana, which is a dahlia that was introduced.
I just bought that.
Have you?
I've literally
what I'm talking about. This is what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
It's everywhere. Yeah.
I brought it from Steve and Lou Edney. I went to do a talk the other day in Lincolnshire, and they were doing a talk. Steve was doing a talk there as well, and they brought some plants to sell, and there was this dahlia there.
Right.
Wow, I've got to have that.
Yeah.
And Lou actually said, "I knew you'd buy this."
That's interesting. So it's massive. It's giant. It's a real beast, but it's not giant in the way that imperialis in what's the huge one?
Yeah, imperialis.
Imperialis is it's more of a vast dome, but ours flowers in sort of December time, which is amazing.
Yeah, well, I don't think in the northeast Norfolk I will ever get away with that, but I have got something very similar that started flowering this year in April.
Oh wow.
Well, I'll just tell you what happened, because we have one of these tree dahlias from Mexico. It came from creek plants.
Yeah.
And, I planted it on the south-facing wall of our house, and this winter has been very mild, so it kept its old stems. They didn't die right back; they died half back. So I topped them off, and the side shoots actually came out in March, and in April they started flowering.
Wow!
It's still in flower now. So
what is it?
It's not It's tenuicaulis, I think. One of the tree dahlias from Krug.
Right.
It's one that is actually slightly more precocious at flowering than lots of the others.
Excellent.
And it. But I mean, its sisters, which I divided the tuber when I got it. Its sisters, which are in the open garden, they don't flower until probably October, late September, early October. But this one, because it's kept its new growth. So I was just questioning in my mind, in actual fact, with our climate changing, and I mean, your Wardian case in London obviously is a lovely enclosed, warm space. But with our climate changing the way it is, perhaps we can expect these dahlias to flower if they hang on to their old growth, winter, and then reshoot. I think their timings are also kind of mixed up.
I think you're quite right. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's such a foreign concept to us to allow a dahlia to continue. And it might get slightly blackened, it might get just a bit hit, but maybe not enough to knock it fully out. And
I did flower tenuicaulis out in the garden. It opened on January the 6th. The flower opened on January the 6th in the morning, and by lunchtime, it had been blown off.
For that moment.
That fleeting moment, all year I waited for that.
That's what it's about, though. I love that. The tampaulipana has this very beautiful sort of like lilac-y, lavendery kind of soft purple. Effectively, it's beautiful. And if we're lucky, it comes out late November, and we've got it for a month and a bit. But it's great. So there we go. That's a great example of how plants that we think are very exciting and new are already very quickly sort of dispersing. And disporums weren't such a big thing 5 years ago.
No, they weren't.
We were trendsetters.
Well, that's one way to look at it.
I think it's also being inquisitive about new plants and new plantings and ways of using them. And I think we're also spurred on by the fact that our climate is changing. When we first bought extra land here, I wouldn't have dared planted a pittosporum outside. Nowadays, the pittosporums are self-sowing in the ground. Right. The same with panthers, the same with eucalyptus. So it's weird. It's weird, but we're very lucky to be going through this period. What comes out at the other end, I don't know. But I mean, it's fascinating.
Agaves, I guess. And
well, we've got those outside here.
Yeah. Brilliant. I mean, you'll know it better than I would. I mean, it's the narrative in gardening at the moment, but it's those who have been gardening for a little bit longer, such as yourself, Alan, who'll really be able to tell us whether that's, because obviously there's a lot of fluctuation in seasons in general, but having to be able to have a steady eye of that across the time and see how that really has changed, that's really interesting. Yeah,
it has changed because we started planting the desert wash here probably 22 years ago, something like that. And what we did is we had a man with a digger came in, and it was a bit like a ballet. He was watching an elephant in a tutu almost, this lumbering great machine. If you could got rid of the sound, it would have been so graceful, scooping out great hollows which we filled with gravel and all the rest of it, and then made raised beds with local flint to try and get the drainage to be as sharp and as quick as possible.
Right.
And walking through the desert today, you would never believe these are tiny little plants that you put in. You're looking up at them, and it is amazing.
Yeah,
and we have one, I think it's Nolinia. There were three that were given to various people. We had one. The other two, unfortunately, died in various winters since. But so we now have the mother of it, the daughter of it, and the granddaughter of it. Last year, the mother had 5 flower spikes on. The daughter hasn't flowered yet. The granddaughter this year is doing this to the mother with 2 flower spikes on it.
And I did like the desert wash at East Ruston. It became like a space age experience on Snowdrop Day because all the newer agaves and things had these little domes over them, and then they looked like all these funny little aliens through the landscape.
Yeah. Well, that's because they are babies, and we do that. We grow them on in the greenhouse, and then when they go out for the first winter, we cover them really to assist on the drainage more than anything else.
Yeah, but it looks great. It looks super cool. So, Matt, what have you brought for show and tell then?
Well, so I thought all I've done, and I don't know how, because again, the light's not going to be very, very useful here, but
look.
All I've done is swipe a load of plants that aren't at their best now because they've been out in the garden doing their thing really well. But I wanted to talk about these because it's a space that I've been absolutely battling with for years since I've been at the museum for a good long while. And this is the first year where the space has actually worked, and it's incredibly windswept. It's incredibly dry. It's poor river silt. soil. It's right on the Thames. It's our sort of river facing part of the garden. It's basically, it took me a really, really long time to realize this, but it's basically the Canary Islands. So it's got a really, really similar climate in the sense that it's generally baked, sun-baked, windswept. It's got this kind of, I suppose, slight saltiness coming from the river, but not entirely. But it's that baking wind basically that's been the issue, and it's taken me forever to work out what to plant there. And I've got an endless list. I've been writing it up the last week of failures in that garden, because it's one of those real trial and error areas. So what I've swiped are the ultimate contenders basically, and these are plants I'm so thrilled and proud of because of what they've managed to achieve in that space. And this year it's really worked. So
logistically, I'm just going to warn you, if you're going to get things out of the vase, Dan Cooper has realised that you need a towel on your lap if you're going to do that.
How should I do this? Well, what I could do, I'll tell you what, should I just bring it? I'll bring it in here and I'll point. Is that better?
That's lovely.
Okay, so I'll start. I mean, this is just a collection. I think I've bunged 10 in here. I've also put some secret surprises. I'll start with these because these don't relate to that space. These are just, and I shouldn't really pick them, so I'm being naughty here, but there are so many. I was just thrilled to see these guys. This is a plantain. It's the plantain that grows on chalk, and it almost exclusively grows in chalkland churchyards. But it was one of those moments of moving to an entirely new environment and going, oh, you're here, brilliant, I love you, you're one of my favorites, you make me feel at home. And so this is Plantago media, which is a pink plantain, which you see out in the kind of amazing meadows in Europe, in sort of Croatia and places like that quite a lot. I mean, maybe it's more common in certain areas and I'm not aware, but I just absolutely love this plant. It's so beautiful to find something so pink sticking out of the ground that otherwise takes the form of a normal plant, normal plantain. So that is
such a lovely frizzly pom-pom flower.
Oh, it does it all. And before that, you've got this really nice tight cone as well. It's just, it's the best. But anyway, you see those and really fat leaves. You see those dotted around, but they bear absolutely no relevance to. They would hate the environment in which the rest of these come from. But so what have I got? So there's a Geranium palmatum, which again with travels and things. So I write a monthly column for the Telegraph, and it's a travel column, and so it's. When I can, I actually picked it up in the pandemic, which is the worst time, obviously, to pick up a travel column. But so I was sort of writing from memory for a while. But one of the trips that I did post-pandemic was to go out to Madeira, which was really great, and see some of those geraniums that grow out there. There's the two Madeira geraniums, palmatum, and well, there's three, but the other one no one really grows. But there's palmatum and maderense, and palmatum just loves that space. And so this year, there's just been this amazing wash of pink. So palmatum is just, I mean, it's biennial, so obviously you sort of have on years and off years depending how much is self-sown.
This is a really interesting one. My mum is going to love this podcast, by the way, because she loves plantains and she is Geranium palmatum's #1 fan. And one of the reasons she loves it is that she's got this very sheltered, quite shady courtyard, but very sort of west facing, so it's nice sun, but she's growing lots of trees, little aces and things around it, so it gets quite a lot of shade, and they self-seed in every available nook and cranny in that kind of warm, slightly sort of semi-shaded space, and they're wonderful because the light shines through those wonderful magenta blooms and catches the big palm leaves as well, and they're wonderful. But it's interesting to hear that they obviously love your situation as well. Yeah, well, I say full sun. I mean, it's west facing, so it's not like south. There's a period where they're in slight shade, so it's a bit of a mix. But and they have that. And rather than maderense, I just love the fact they've got these much more splayed out flowers. They're a little bit more kind of wild looking. Maderense can be quite clipped and bald and tight, whereas so they've been amazing, and this year this has just really been their year. But again, what's been lovely, every plant in this collection is really has some kind of link really to places I've been or something I've read about or whatever. It's all quite sort of with everything with the museum, in sort of museum culture, there's a lot of sort of association and a kind of, I suppose, a literary element as well. So I love it for lots of reasons, but palmatum's been amazing this year. I mean, none of these are particularly rare or anything like that. They're just ones that work really, really well, and ones that I would plant lots in the future. Sisyrinchium striatum, which is obviously a bulletproof for that environment, but those pops of yellow this year have been particularly strong. Phlomis russeliana, which again, certainly common, but just does really, really well in that space. That was sort of the first plant to
take hold in the soil, like to break the space, and to like, so basically the space started out as a hedge, which was just the silliest idea in the world. It was part of our front garden is all yew hedge, with soft areas of soft planting, which is brilliant. It was conceived by Christopher Bradley Hull, and it was just it's a really beautiful space, and it was designed as a kind of piazza holding space so that visitors would come in, have a bit of area to hang out before they go into the museum. But I think, yeah, it takes having gardened there a long while to really, I mean, even for me it was a shock how this particular section of hedge died so quickly, despite watering, changing the soil, everything we could do to keep it alive. But we're surrounded by big plane trees as well, and they just sucked up every bit of moisture. So there was this one area that just gave up the ghost basically immediately, and we tried, and that's when I started realizing, right, what else can we put in there? And so russeliana was the sort of first one to I don't know, to take hold after lots of things had died. Go back to the canaries, which are really, which are generally quite a big influence for me horticulturally. I mean, the Canary Islands have got a sort of reputation for lots of things, but you can't beat the horticulture there. I mean, you can't beat the natural plants that thrive there, because they're just, they're fascinating, and they've evolved in their own space, and they're bizarre. So Isoplexis, which I think has gone back to Digitalis now, I can't remember.
Yes, it has.
There you go. Canariensis, which having a nice chat with Andy Sturgeon about. He's a big fan, and we were discussing the various merits of when to chop back and things like that, because you can really, I sort of experimented with them this year, and gave a few a different kind of chop, and left some to flower, and actually those that I've chopped have really bulked up and looked amazing, with sort of a good sort of 10 flower spikes, and so you can very quickly sort of bulk them up by chopping them at the right time, which I think I did back in March. And so they that's been a really cool one, and these pops of orange go really well. I think I'm a big fan of orange.
That Digitalis, or Isoplexis, that we used to be called Isoplexis canariensis, that's been used as a cross with other foxgloves now, and there's a whole range of them that bear the Isoplexis, shall we say, bloodline. And they also don't have quite the hardiness of a good old common old foxglove.
No, they certainly don't. No.
So, I mean, they are plants for a changing climate, really. I mean, I've grown that for years, and quite often Isoplexis, I take cuttings every year, but quite often we used to lose it in the winter.
Right.
This past winter, I mean, they're flowering in my garden now, and that is because they have done so well with the climate change again.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Did I see a Teucrium leaf?
Of course.
Yep,
What Mediterranean garden wouldn't be complete without a Teucrium?
Absolutely, yeah.
Certainly. Where's my Teucrium? Yeah, he's in there somewhere. Oh, there you go. Yeah. So that's just fruticans, but again, they're a mixed bag, really. I think there are more and more kind of coming into cultivation now, aren't there? They're a really diverse genus, and there's lots and lots of them out there. But and I know quite a few have gone into the new garden at Sissinghurst in the sort of Delos remake, again by Dan, with Troy there, and lots of more interesting ones. That's in there. There's quite a few. That's kind of one of the more structural shrubs. What I don't have is some of my junipers. I've been putting, that's going to take, I'm probably going to certainly have left the job, or at least have died by the time those junipers get up to a really good size. But I've planted, they're also a fantastic plant for that kind of environment. They've done really, really well. Grey owl is the one that I've been growing particularly. It's a nice big, slightly glaucous-y grey coloration, which is beautiful. And that along with the Teucrium, Vitex, and a few others that make the kind of structural elements of that garden. But Teucrium's great.
Just explain what Vitex is and what it looks like, I think, for everybody listening.
Vitex is a funny kind of, it's almost Buddleia-like.
Yes, it's much more refined. Come.
Well, quite exactly. Yeah, I saw it growing in where did I see it? In Sardinia, and loved it. I found it growing along a sort of riparian environment, but dealing very well with that kind of heat. Thought, that might work very well for this space. So Vitex, it's just a very elegant. I would very elegant Buddleia with sort of more refined, thinner flowers, and that same blue kind of purple coloration
and white.
Right? So that's in there, but I don't have it with me. And then Cranberry. So some things get bunged in from exhibitions. We did a big exhibition on Derek Jarman, based on his Prospect Cottage garden, and it's actually where I got the shingle. We filled one of the spaces in the Garden Museum for the exhibition space with sort of shingle for the floor to recreate the sense of stepping over stones in Dungeness, and so that heavy shingle I repurposed once the planting had gone in. So that exhibition opened in 2020, as soon as we were able to open after the first lockdown, I think. I think it's between the lockdowns, and so it was great. It was really popular. I mean, Derek Jarman's very popular in general now, and especially about the garden and with the republication of books. But I just repurposed, as soon as the planting was finished, I used all that shingle, the sort of tons and tons of shingle that we put on the floor at the exhibition to finish off as a mulch, because it all felt very Dungeness as well. I mean, the landscape it still has that same environment. So sea kale we've grown lots of for the exhibition anyway, and so that came from Beth Chatto Nursery, and so that's gone in as well. It's not flowered, but it sort of dotted itself around in various kind of wild kind of sense.
You have to watch out if you grow that though, because it's a beloved food plant of the large white butterfly. And
I did wonder actually. Should I check for eggs? I did wonder. I mean, everyone's got to do their bit for wildlife, haven't they?
Yeah, exactly.
But that's a great point.
You know, Matt, that is my line when anybody says to me in the garden, "You've got nettles over there." Yes, but they're food for butterflies.
Of course they are. Yeah. Yeah. We've got to give something back, right?
Exactly.
So that cranberry leaf is such a lovely foil. That kind of lovely glaucus and the shape of the leaf. That lovely frothy sort of frilly-ish edge.
To quote your mum, it butchers up that arrangement, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah, I mean,
element of masculinity.
There's certainly a collection of items, much like our museum, as opposed to a sort of, or much like Cedric Morris's style, than necessarily a pretty arrangement. But yeah, that's it comes up beautiful with the early purple spikes as well as they start to unfurl. Is lovely as well with the cranberries. So there's that, and what I think there's and then just I think there's some Nepeta in there. There's Six Hills Giant, and there's Phocenii potentially, but yeah, there's a few Nepetas that have obviously taken well to that space as well. And some
I
heterochroism.
really love the pink. It's that kind of wildflower combo of the pink of the Geranium palmatum with the yellow of the Phlomis and the Sisyrinchium. That's that gorgeous thing that nature so often does. Combining really strong pinky purples with yellow, and I think gardeners. Well, certainly, I mean, Alan, we talk about it almost every week. I think that people have this hatred of yellow, but it is such a joyful, wonderful combination.
I love it. I mean, there are good yellows and bad yellows, but I mean, you're forgetting nitpicky about it. But in general, I think yellow and orange for me are great. But it's also an excuse that if you're going to have sun, it's the only area in the garden with sun, really. And so it's an excuse to do colour. And so, we're very refined in other ways. Our courtyard garden is a very refined, elegant palette of greens and more greens and lots more greens. Which is, and it really does work, and beautiful whites and spring pockets of color. But it's it's what we have to do with lots of our woodland planting as well, because we call it woodland planting because of the enormous plane trees, but similar environment. But so this area is really my excuse to muck around with color. And so it started off as like it's going to be just blues and yellows was my original plan, but soft blues and yellows, and then obviously pinks came in and oranges and so it's all sorts now. And there's a great, I didn't get it, I should have, I don't know why I didn't, but there's lots of the Italicum papaver poppy that also floats this orange throughout the space as well, which is great.
Well, that's lovely. Yeah.
Considering that there's so much restrained, classy planting elsewhere, what do regular visitors make to a crazy, wildish colour combo?
Yeah, I don't know. I hope it was quite, it's really exploded with colour this year, really for the first time. I think everything was sort of getting ready, and so I don't know. People do stop, and it's funny. It's not an area you can really. It's only for the brave to access because it's not obvious. It's kind of I'm always pleased when I see someone who's made it in there, because you see it, you kind of get a glimpse from it, but it's all raised up, and we built these. It's got some of these sort of dry stone. It's got a bit of dry stone in there and stuff in it because it's all raised up above the street level, so you can sort of see it as you come past, but it's all tucked away. And so I love it when people sort of barge their way through and find their way in, because obviously they've been intrigued by it. But I think people like it. I think they're used. I think there's not been colour there before. And I think Nigel Dunnett said something recently. I interviewed him about the super bloom that he's doing at the Tower of London, and he made a really good point about how colour actually is. It's kind of fundamental to human beings, and in terms of flowers, and flower color. Nigel has said this about flowers. Andy Sturgeon has said this about garden design. It's about, he's tried lots of elegant designs with greens and whatnot, and really people just love color. And there's something about flowers, however mishmash the color is, it's still so alluring, you know, people still want it. And I think I hope that the garden's gone down quite well in that regard.
That sounded very profound, but I think it's the way people are thinking today.
Yeah.
You know, and if you go back to the 1970s, everything had to be pale white. And I mean, I remember a piece of writing when Christopher Lloyd said, well, why don't you grow a cream flowering rose against a cream wall? And if you really want to be picky, you can take all the leaves off.
Yeah.
I read an article a few years ago where somebody pointed out, probably a psychologist or something, pointed out that when we're children, we get dressed in colour, all of our like toys are colourful, our rooms are painted with colour, and somewhere along the way, all of the colour gets stripped away, and adult clothes, it's probably changing now, but adult clothes are always greys and blacks and browns and whites and sort of more muted palettes. And yet actually, colour does, not to everybody, I'm sure, but it does bring joy. It does lift your spirits.
It's intrinsic. Yeah, completely. There's something very, yeah.
See, I never got to the grey stage. You open my wardrobe and it looks like an oversized toddler lives here.
But that's in now. You're right. That's in. That's on the right side of it.
And dungarees for adults as well.
Yeah,
the fashions, they've been listening to my mind.
Yeah, and a combination of pink and peach for the set, of course.
Exactly. So on trend.
Yeah.
So does this mean when you get gardening in your chalky new plot that it's going to be a riot of colour, or are you going to be going?
Well, I could be sort of. Yeah. What's the? There's a real array of sorbus of white beams here. There's something about chalk I'm learning. It's new to me, and it might just be, I'm sure it's just a very passing spring thing, but everything feels pastel. Like there's a real light, kind of very soft grey kind of cheekiness to the whole thing, and I love white beams in general, but they're everywhere here. They obviously grow really well on chalk, and they just look stunning, and there's this very like airy lightness, and I think you could match that with, you know, with lots of kind of, it's the things that love the field. It's those light pinks, geraniums, and lights, you know, trefoils and knapweeds and all that kind of stuff. But, you know, so I'm tempted. Yeah, I'm going to continue with the color. I think there's no point. My exciting thing is, the whole thing is terrace fences. So I'm going to really invest in climbers in a whole new way. I'm really excited about trying every single kind of climber I can get my hands on. So that's all new to me. You know, there are lots of sort of tried and tested ones, but lots that I don't know and have never grown before. So that's what I'm really excited about. Is first step, get every single bit of wall started with a climber, you know, and box myself in, and then start adding as much color beneath that, you know, as I can.
I don't know enough about chalk to make any recommendations. I mean, Alan, I don't know whether you've got a great, you know so much, so you probably do have a whole part of your brain that's just chalky climbers, but is there anything you recommend?
I don't know much about chalky climbers, but I do know that viburnums grow very well on chalk, and I know that some of them can actually be trained and cut, providing you're the master of them, to grow against the wall. Robert Lane Fox was writing a few weeks ago, and it was a fairly common viburnum. I can't remember the exact name now, but he cuts it back immediately after flowering, which is in May.
Right.
And it makes just enough growth to keep it close to the wall.
Interesting.
So that was quite a useful tip, I think. And then, of course, you know, pink hydrangeas. You won't get blue on chalk.
Yeah. That's true. That's very true.
Is the nature reserve Hills and Holes up at Barnack, which I love to go to, I'm fairly certain that is chalk, and that's always covered in pulsatillas. You get all those wonderful, you know, the pink bells of the past flower, and then the frizzly, crazy cousin seed heads. That's
what I'm talking about. Yeah, that's a great point, pulsatillas. Yeah. That's like meadowy kind of crisp earliness. Yeah. Viburnum's interesting. Yeah, I had this idea of, because it's such a small garden, my original plan was to try and do it all from seeds and cuttings and not actually buy any plants, was my plan. I don't know how far I was going to get with that, but I went and pillaged my parents' garden for all sorts of shrubs and climbers and things, which are all growing on as cuttings and seemingly doing okay so far, but I don't know whether I'll get, it was kind of a test of my, you know, patience and endurance, as to see whether I can. I'm always shocked at how quickly things actually do grow and bulk up, and I thought, well, why not try an entire garden from seed or from cuttings? So that's the current thinking.
I didn't quite do that, but I did try, for budget reasons, to start with plug plants and a few in lots of seed and cuttings and things, but then it didn't work. I bought a lot.
As soon as you're in the nursery, that's it. I know, a plant fair or whatever is
that would make a very good book, A Garden from Seed and Cuttings.
Well, that's partly what I wanted. Don't tell
that should keep your focus.
I wondered, but no, it's more, I think it's more just things will grow here, even in this tiny space that I struggled to grow at the Garden Museum for various different environmental reasons. And so it was more just the joy of propagation that I'm kind of wanting to get back into really here.
Yeah, well, we might have just given you a few Phlomos, I suppose, as you consider how to plant up your chalky garden. If you are tuning in for the first time, Phlomo is that feeling, that fear of missing out you get when you see a plant or remember a plant that you haven't got and you feel like you must have it. It's a must have in your life. It's interesting that we talked so much about Benton End. A dear friend of ours who featured on our Galanthophylle special many moons ago here on Talking Dirty, the wonderful Brian Ellis, has quite the collection of Benton irises, and his Instagram has kept me Phlomoing after lots of them. Joyfully, I got Benton Olive from Beth Chatto's nursery last year, which was a wonderful moment, and I adore her. But I absolutely loved Benton Farewell on Brian's Instagram, which is this very pale lilac. It's almost grey, which you wouldn't think would be my bag really, but it has this sort of lemony flush to it, bronzy. The orange is coming in because I do love orange. Bronzy sort of veining brush strokes to it. So subtle and classy, the opposite really to most of my plant choices. So I really, really thought that would be a lovely one for the garden. And Benton Avora as well, which is purple with flushes of pink and kind of an orange beard, so more orange to to go in my many toned orange garden. So Benton irises always give me Phlomo. So they're just two, but do go and check out Galanthoholic's Instagram because there are so many and you're going to want all of them.
They really are, and it's incredible, and they keep getting found all the time. Sarah Cook is endeavoring to give us more, so she's tracking them down all across the world, I think. So
yeah, they're fab. Matt, whereabouts do you think you are with your Phlomo? Is there anything in particular that's screaming out to you that you just want to get?
Well, my big thing at the moment, this is going to completely undermine everything I just said about trying to grow everything myself, is that one thing I do want to get is the right tree for this space. I could probably afford maybe 2 trees, but that's about it for the space that we've got. 2 small compact trees, and there's nothing more fun than sort of getting the perfect tree for the perfect space. So really, for me right now, I was in Texas. I was in Texas at the beginning of the year, and just in time to see all of the eastern redbuds coming out, which is the Narcissus canadensis, which is just like everywhere. And so you'd see them in the hedges, and then you see them as standard trees in the street, and they were just forgetting that way. There was a great Judas tree at Benton End, the classic Judas tree, Sisyrinchium, but it was vast and old and gangly and beautiful. But seeing that there's something about the canadensis that's stunning. So currently my thinking is that would be of my 2, that would be the tree I'd most want in this garden. It's a fleeting passing moment that it flowers, but nothing flowers like that. It's just astonishing. And then I would otherwise go for American. Everything's American with me at the moment, but American Crataegus carrierii, which is the hybrid, which is you don't see it planted here as much. Weirdly, it made its way into agricultural use as a hedging plant. I don't know when and for how long, but you sometimes see it. These amazing berries turn up in the hedges. Saw it once in Suffolk, but that as a standard tree is beautiful as well. So that's where I'm really thinking at the moment is trees, and those 2.
Oh, I was, earlier I really wanted to ask you if you were going to put a tree or 2 in that garden and what you were going to pick. So I'm really glad I didn't have time.
There you go. Yeah, that's what I'm after.
Oh, brilliant. Well, what about you, Mr. Gray? Where is your Phlomo at this week?
Well, it's very boring from what you 2 have just said, actually. I'm still lusting after a rose, and you'll know the rose that I'm lusting after, and it was a single rose that we saw at the Chelsea Flower Show. It has single blush white flowers with a boss of red stamens. It's just the common old garden Jacqueline du Pré, which I think is lovely.
And you know what? I've bought it.
Yeah.
I've got it, and he hasn't.
And I haven't had time to go, and she's bought it, and I haven't got it.
Extra Phlomo right now.
But it will come. And the other one that I thought this reminded me of this morning. The rose that I want is called the Shropshire Lad. It's an Austin rose. It's basically the same color as her shirt. It's kind of pink and apricot and peachy and kind of meringue and gooey and lovely and tasty and smelly. And I wish I have it. It's growing in a friend of mine's garden. And Suzanne, you introduced me to it. I forgot about it. I've just remembered it. I'm going to have it.
I wanted Shropshire Lad for a long time, and I got this garden and I bought it bare root, and the dog dug it up 3 times in about a month, because obviously I put all the food around it, and so I was very worried for it. I was very worried that it was going to have such a bad start in life, but amazingly, despite that rocky start, it is so strong, vigorous, healthy, this lovely flushed new growth, uber floriferous, amazing smell. Whenever I walk, I mean, my garden is very small, but I kind of walk in the direction of that rose, and you just, in the warm air, just start to get that drift of lovely rose scent coming towards you. So yeah, it's absolutely wonderful.
You two are probably going to think I'm mad, but I have today decided that I'm going to plant a passion flower. We had an abutilon growing on the south front of the house, which it grew very more leaves than flowers, many more leaves than flowers. One of the small flowered hybrids, a bit like hot lava or something like that. And it, you know, the amount of leaf was too much for the flower. Yeah. So I have decided to put a passion flower out there, and it's one of those very tender pink ones. I've had it growing in my greenhouse, and it's got too big. And I'm loath to cut it, so I'm going to put it out on that front. If it lives, it lives. If it dies, it dies. But if it gives me a sum of oohs and ahs from these flashy pink flowers, I shall enjoy it.
We're about to. We're just going to switch we've had cerula growing in the courtyard here, and we're going to switch it out for Victoria. I'm just waiting for them to grow on slightly more. I picked it up at Chelsea. So I'll be in line with you then, and we'll see how we do. Yeah, I'm excited.
Yeah, you can come to the funeral of mine, and I'll come to the funeral of yours.
Most likely, yes.
Well, you never know. You never know. Always back your luck.
Yeah.
Well, what an exciting array of plants, so much inspiration. And it's lovely to actually, talk to the living, breathing Matt Collins rather than just read your words on a page. However much, you come to life through your writing, it is lovely to actually talk to you.
Yeah, well, it's great. I've loved it. It's been brilliant. Thanks for having me.
Come back again. But in the meantime, happy gardening.
Happy gardening, everybody.
Bye. Just moved to a new house, and it was sort of slightly difficult finding an appropriate space.
Alan's spoiled for choice. He's like living in a magazine shoot the whole time.
I know. What's that? That's an incredible space. That looks amazing.
Which room of your house is that, Alan?
Morning room.
The morning room.
The morning room. Very nice. I'm in my 2-year-old's little bedroom.
What is your cat doing, by the way, Alan?
Yeah, what's going on over there?
I've got both dogs in because it's so wet, and they get very cross when the cat comes to try and make the fuss around my legs, and they take the cat. So that's what's happening.
Oh, hello, Gigi. Hello.
She pricked her ears up when you said her name. Morning, and I've completely forgotten the name.
You froze on my screen, haven't come back.
That was a real cliffhanger. What was he going to say?
Still froze. I think I know what he was going to say, but I don't want to steal his thunder. Panic as I'm saying these things that I've called someone the wrong name or something.
I'm not that guy.
You put completely a different person.
Work in construction, I don't know what you're talking about.